In 130 AD, the most powerful man in the world, Emperor Hadrian, was so devastated by the death of a beautiful young man that he declared him a god, built an entire city in his honor, and named a constellation after him. This wasn't just any young man. This was Antinous, and he was one of thousands of male concubines who served in the imperial palaces of Rome for over 5 centuries. Their stories are written in blood, tears, and marble, yet mainstream history has buried them in silence. Today we're pulling back the velvet curtains of the Roman Empire to reveal a world where beauty was currency, youth was power, and survival meant navigating the deadliest game ever played. What you're about to discover will fundamentally change how you see one of history's greatest civilizations. And if you think you know the Roman Empire, think again. Before we dive into this hidden world, if you're someone who believes that every voice from history deserves to be heard, especially those that have been silenced for nearly 2,000 years, then you need to subscribe to Time-Bound Empire right now. Because we're about to uncover stories that mainstream history textbooks don't dare tell, and trust me, you won't find this anywhere else. The young man's body floated face down in the Nile River, his once perfect features now bloated and unrecognizable. When Emperor Hadrian's guards pulled 20-year-old Antinous from the murky waters in October of 130 AD, they didn't just fish out a corpse, they dragged ashore the end of an era and the beginning of one of history's most extravagant displays of imperial grief. But Antinous wasn't just any victim of the Nile's treacherous currents. He was the crown jewel of an institution that had existed in the shadows of Roman power for generations, the emperor's male concubines. These weren't the female courtesans that Hollywood loves to portray, draped in silk and feeding grapes to toga-clad senators. No, this was something far more complex, far more dangerous, and infinitely more tragic. To understand the fate of Rome's male concubines, we need to shatter some myths right from the start. This wasn't simply an extension of Greek pederasty, that cultural practice where older men mentored younger ones in a relationship that often included sexual elements. The Roman imperial system of male concubinage was something entirely different. It was institutionalized, systematized, and brutal in ways that would make modern human traffickers blush. The emperor's household wasn't just a family residence. It was a complex machine designed to project power, and every person within its walls served a specific function. While the empress handled the political marriages and state ceremonies, the male concubines occupied a parallel universe of intimate power. They were entertainers, confidants, and objects of desire all rolled into one precarious package. Think about the sheer audacity of it all. Here were the rulers of the known world, men who controlled the fate of millions, who could order the construction of walls across entire countries and aqueducts across mountain ranges, yet they surrounded themselves with teenage boys and young men whose primary qualification was their physical beauty. It sounds almost absurd until you realize the strategic brilliance behind it. These young men served multiple purposes in the imperial machine. First, they provided intimate companionship without the political complications that came with female relationships. A concubine's family couldn't threaten the succession or form dangerous political alliances. Second, they served as a form of conspicuous consumption. Owning the most beautiful young men in the empire was the ultimate status symbol. Finally, they functioned as a kind of living artwork, human sculptures that decorated the emperor's private spaces. But here's where the story gets truly heartbreaking. Unlike the powerful courtesans of other civilizations who could accumulate wealth and influence over time, male concubines in the Roman system were trapped in a golden cage that grew smaller with each passing year. Youth was their only currency, and it was a currency that depreciated daily. The selection process alone reveals the systematic nature of their exploitation. Imperial agents scoured the empire, from the olive groves of Greece to the cedar forests of Lebanon, from the Germanic tribes to the kingdoms of North Africa. They weren't looking for just any attractive young man. They had specific criteria. The ideal candidate was between 14 and 18 years old, possessed of classical beauty, intelligent enough to carry on conversation but not so clever as to be threatening, and preferably from a family desperate enough to sell them or powerless enough to have them taken. Regional preferences shifted with imperial taste. Trajan favored the dark-eyed beauties of Spain, his homeland. Hadrian had a notorious preference for Greek boys, believing they embodied classical perfection. Later emperors developed tastes for Germanic blondes or North African exotics. These preferences weren't mere personal quirks. They were empire-wide mandates that drove a massive human trafficking operation. Once selected, these young men underwent a transformation that was part education, part grooming, and part psychological breaking. They were taught to read and write, to sing and play musical instruments, to recite poetry and engage in philosophical discussions. They learned the elaborate court protocols, how to dress the emperor, how to serve wine with the proper rituals, how to massage away the tensions of ruling an empire. But they were also taught something far more insidious: how to disappear. How to make themselves invisible when the emperor was conducting serious business, how to anticipate needs without being asked, how to provide comfort without seeming to have personalities of their own. They were being trained to become beautiful objects, living furniture in the emperor's private world. The psychological conditioning was perhaps the cruelest aspect of their preparation. They were simultaneously told they were special, chosen from among millions to serve the most powerful man on earth, while also being reminded constantly that they were utterly replaceable. New shipments of boys arrived regularly, and the older concubines could see their own futures in the hollow eyes of those who had fallen from favor. The imperial household maintained careful hierarchies among the concubines. The newest arrivals were little more than servants, attending to basic needs and hoping to catch the emperor's eye. Those who succeeded in capturing imperial attention found themselves elevated to positions of precarious privilege. They might receive gifts of jewelry, fine clothing, or even their own slaves. A few exceptional individuals became genuine confidants, trusted with state secrets and allowed to influence minor policy decisions. But this apparent success came with a terrible price. The higher a concubine rose in the emperor's favor, the more dangerous his position became. Other concubines plotted against favorites, court officials resented their influence, and the emperor's own moods could shift like Mediterranean weather. Today's beloved could become tomorrow's exile, or worse. The fate of Antinous illustrates both the heights and depths of the concubine system. Hadrian genuinely seems to have loved him, taking him on tours of the empire, commissioning hundreds of statues in his honor, and treating him almost as an unofficial consort. Yet even Antinous, at the apex of imperial favor, met a mysterious end in the Nile. Officially it was an accident. Many historians suspect suicide. Some whisper about murder. What we know for certain is that when news of Antinous' death reached Hadrian, the emperor's grief was so profound that it scandalized even the jaded Roman elite. He ordered the deification of his dead lover, founded a city named Antinopolis on the spot where the body was found, and commissioned more statues and artworks of Antinous than of any other private individual in Roman history. This brings us to a crucial point that many people miss when they study this period: the emotional reality of these relationships. It's easy to dismiss the emperor-concubine dynamic as purely exploitative, and certainly the power imbalance was absolute. But the historical record suggests that genuine affection, even love, could develop within this twisted system. This makes the tragedy even more profound, because it means that some of these young men experienced real intimacy and connection, only to have it ripped away by the inexorable march of time, political necessity, or imperial whim. The Roman system differed dramatically from similar practices in other ancient civilizations. In the Persian Empire, royal favorites might be elevated to positions of real political power. In China, imperial concubines could become powerful dowager empresses. But Rome's male concubines were trapped in a system that offered temporary luxury in exchange for their youth, with no path to lasting security or influence. As we delve deeper into this hidden world, we'll discover how these young men navigated the treacherous currents of imperial favor, what happened to them when that favor inevitably faded, and how their stories illuminate the darker aspects of Roman civilization that most historians prefer to ignore. Their voices have been silenced for 2 millennia, but their stories survive in fragmentary records, architectural evidence, and the psychological scars they left on the empire itself. The golden cage of Roman imperial concubinage wasn't just a personal tragedy for the thousands of young men who lived and died within its confines. It was a symptom of a deeper sickness in Roman society, the belief that absolute power justified any level of human exploitation. Understanding their fate helps us understand not just the Roman Empire, but the nature of power itself and the human cost of unchecked authority. But we're only at the beginning of this story. What you've learned so far is just the surface of a much deeper and more disturbing reality. In the coming chapters, we'll explore how these young men were actually acquired and trained, what their daily lives looked like behind palace walls, and most importantly, what happened to them when their beauty faded or their luck ran out. The slave market in Delos stretched along the harbor like a human bazaar of the damned. On any given day in the 1st century AD, over 10,000 people changed hands on this small Greek island. Prisoners of war, debtors, kidnapped children, and most relevant to our story, carefully selected young men destined for the imperial palaces of Rome. Marcus Junius Silanus stood in the morning sun, his experienced eye scanning the latest arrivals from Gaul. As one of Emperor Trajan's chief procurement officers, he had spent the better part of 2 decades identifying and acquiring the most beautiful young men in the empire for imperial service. His commission was simple: find perfection, purchase it, and prepare it for the emperor's pleasure. The human cost of this transaction never seemed to cross his mind. The morning's inventory included 12 Germanic boys, their fair hair gleaming like spun gold in the Mediterranean light. 3 were immediately dismissed: too tall, too muscular, too obviously masculine. The Roman imperial aesthetic preferred its male concubines to occupy a carefully defined middle ground: old enough to be intellectually engaging, young enough to be physically appealing, masculine enough to be exotic, but feminine enough to be non-threatening. This wasn't accidental. The Roman system of male concubinage had evolved over generations into a precise science of human objectification. Imperial buyers like Silanus carried detailed specifications that read like livestock breeding manuals. Height between 5 feet 4 inches and 5 feet 8 inches. Age between 14 and 19, with 16 considered optimal. Clear skin, symmetrical features, and most importantly what the Romans called docile eyes. A look that suggested intelligence without rebellion, attraction without predatory sexuality. Regional specialization had developed to feed the imperial appetite for variety. The slave markets of Alexandria specialized in North African beauties, their dark skin and exotic features prized by emperors seeking novel experiences. Syrian dealers offered young men trained in the arts of massage and perfumery, their skills as valuable as their appearance. The Germanic tribes provided an endless supply of fair-haired youths whose novelty never seemed to fade in Roman markets. But procurement was only the first step in a process that would fundamentally transform these young men from individuals into commodities. Once purchased, they were transported to specialized training facilities scattered throughout the empire. These weren't schools in any recognizable sense. They were human factories designed to strip away identity and rebuild personality according to imperial specifications. The training facility outside Rome where most imperial concubines received their preparation was a sprawling complex that housed up to 300 young men at any given time. From the outside, it resembled a luxury villa with its marble columns and carefully tended gardens. Inside, it operated with the efficiency of a military camp and the psychological manipulation of a cult. New arrivals underwent a systematic process of identity destruction and reconstruction that began the moment they crossed the threshold. Their original names were discarded and replaced with Greek appellations that emphasized their new function: Eros, Adonis, Ganymede, Narcissus. Their clothing was burned and replaced with standardized tunics that emphasized their youth and beauty while stripping away any connection to their former lives. The physical transformation was only the beginning. The psychological reconditioning was far more thorough and infinitely more cruel. These young men were taught to think of themselves not as individuals with rights and desires, but as objects designed to provide pleasure and comfort to their imperial master. They were trained to anticipate needs they couldn't articulate, to provide companionship without developing genuine relationships, to be simultaneously intimate and distant. The curriculum covered every aspect of what the Romans considered civilized life. Language instruction was paramount. Concubines needed to converse intelligently on poetry, philosophy, and politics while never expressing personal opinions on any of these subjects. They studied rhetoric but were trained never to argue. They learned history but were taught to see themselves as outside its flow, temporary ornaments rather than active participants. Physical training encompassed much more than maintaining their appearance, though that was certainly a priority. They learned massage techniques from Egyptian masters, dance from Greek instructors, and the elaborate protocols of Roman court life. They were taught to dress the emperor with ritualistic precision, to serve wine with the exact gestures that tradition demanded, and to provide silent comfort during the long hours when the weight of empire pressed most heavily on imperial shoulders. Music and poetry were considered essential skills, but here again the training emphasized performance over creativity. These young men became living jukeboxes, capable of producing any song or recitation the emperor might desire, but never encouraged to compose their own works or express their own emotions through art. Their creativity, like their sexuality, belonged entirely to their master. Perhaps most cruelly, they were taught to compete with each other while maintaining the appearance of harmony. The imperial household couldn't function with constant open warfare among the concubines, but the system depended on competition to maintain standards and prevent the formation of powerful alliances. The training facilities perfected techniques of psychological manipulation that pitted the young men against each other while making them believe they were part of a privileged brotherhood. The economics of this system were staggering in their scope and sophistication. A single high-quality male concubine could cost as much as a luxury villa, and the emperor's household maintained dozens at any given time. But the true expense lay not in the initial purchase price but in the ongoing costs of maintenance, training, and replacement. These young men had a functional lifespan measured in years rather than decades, and the constant need for fresh faces drove a massive and continuous trade. Regional preferences created market fluctuations that would have been familiar to any commodities trader. When Emperor Hadrian developed his famous obsession with Greek culture, the price of Greek boys soared across the empire. Germanic youths commanded premium prices during periods of military expansion into barbarian territories, their exotic appearance serving as living trophies of conquest. North African markets boomed whenever an emperor sought to demonstrate the empire's global reach through the diversity of his household. The economic impact extended far beyond the direct purchase prices. Entire industries developed to support the concubine trade. Specialized ships transported human cargo with the care usually reserved for fine wines or precious artworks. Professional trainers commanded enormous fees for their ability to transform raw recruits into polished court ornaments. Cosmetic manufacturers developed products specifically designed to enhance and preserve the youthful appearance that was these young men's primary asset. But behind all these economic calculations lay individual human tragedies that the Roman record-keepers rarely bothered to document. We catch glimpses of the psychological toll in scattered graffiti found in the ruins of training facilities, desperate messages scratched into walls by young men who knew they might never see their families again. Lucius of Gaul remembers his mother, reads one such inscription. "The sun sets but does not rise again," reads another, its meaning painfully clear. The training process typically lasted between 6 months and 2 years, depending on the recruit's initial skills and the emperor's current needs. Those who failed to meet standards faced fates that were rarely documented but can be imagined. The successful graduates faced a different kind of uncertain future. They would be transported to Rome to begin their service in the imperial household, where their real education and survival would begin. The irony of the entire system was that it created exactly the kind of young men most likely to suffer in imperial service. By selecting for intelligence and sensitivity, then training them to be emotionally responsive and physically attractive, the Romans were essentially manufacturing victims. These weren't hardened survivors who might adapt to the brutal realities of court life. They were cultivated flowers thrown into a world of political intrigue and imperial caprice. The selection and training process reveals something crucial about Roman imperial psychology that extends far beyond questions of sexuality or personal preference. This was a civilization that had systematized the transformation of human beings into luxury goods with the same precision they applied to engineering aqueducts or organizing military campaigns. The bureaucratic efficiency of the concubine system reflects a deeper Roman belief that absolute power justified any level of human exploitation. Yet even within this dehumanizing system, individual personalities somehow survived. Archaeological evidence suggests that some concubines maintained secret correspondences with family members, developed genuine friendships with fellow servants, and even found ways to express creativity within the severe constraints of their positions. These fragments of resistance make their ultimate fates even more poignant. As we move deeper into their world, we'll discover how these carefully prepared young men navigated the actual realities of imperial service. The training facilities could prepare them for the protocols and expectations of court life, but nothing could truly prepare them for the psychological complexities of serving as intimate companions to the most powerful and often unstable men in the world. The beauty that had made them valuable would become their greatest vulnerability. The intelligence that had saved them from lesser forms of slavery would make them acutely aware of their powerlessness. And the emotional sensitivity that made them effective companions would ensure that every loss of imperial favor cut them to their very souls. Their stories remind us that behind every system of oppression lie individual human beings whose suffering was real, whose hopes were genuine, and whose voices deserve to be heard across the centuries. In the next part of our journey, we'll step inside the imperial palaces themselves to witness how these young men lived day by day in the golden cage of Roman power. The imperial palace on the Palatine Hill never slept. Even in the darkest hours before dawn, shadows moved through marble corridors as the emperor's household prepared for another day of managing the world's largest empire. But in the private wing known as the Domus Transitoria, a different kind of activity stirred as the emperor's male concubines began their daily rituals of survival. 18-year-old Alexios, formerly Marcus from a small village in Thrace, woke as he had every morning for the past 2 years, with a moment of disorientation as he remembered where he was and what he had become. The silk sheets and golden fixtures of his small but luxurious chamber served as daily reminders of his transformation from free peasant to imperial property. The room had no locks on the inside, a subtle but constant reminder that his beautiful prison could be entered at any time by any number of people who outranked him, which was essentially everyone in the palace hierarchy. The morning routine never varied. First came the physical preparation that would consume nearly 2 hours of his day. Roman imperial aesthetics demanded perfection, and maintaining that perfection required constant effort. Alexios began with exercises designed to maintain his slender but toned physique. Enough muscle to suggest masculinity, but not so much as to appear threatening or overly mature. A specialized trainer supervised this routine, making adjustments based on the emperor's current preferences. Next came the elaborate grooming process that transformed these young men into living artworks. Professional cosmeticians, usually Greek slaves who commanded enormous respect within the household hierarchy, applied treatments designed to maintain the youthful appearance that was their subjects' primary currency. Skin was exfoliated with pumice and oiled with exotic unguents from across the empire. Hair was styled with heated irons and held in place with perfumed waxes. Even body hair was carefully managed, removed from some areas, trimmed in others, all according to current imperial fashion. The psychological preparation was equally rigorous and far more complex. Each concubine received daily briefings on the emperor's mood, upcoming schedule, and current preoccupations. They learned which topics might interest him in conversation, which subjects to avoid at all costs, and how to read the subtle signs that indicated whether their presence would be welcome or intrusive at any given moment. These briefings came from Gaius Pompeius, the chief of the imperial household, a man whose survival through multiple emperors' reigns had earned him legendary status among the palace staff. Pompeius understood that managing the emperor's male concubines required a delicate balance of indulgence and control. Too much freedom and they might develop dangerous ambitions or inconvenient attachments. Too little and they would lose the natural charm and spontaneity that made them appealing companions in the first place. The daily schedule varied depending on the emperor's activities and moods, but certain patterns had emerged over the years. Morning hours were typically reserved for younger concubines who could provide cheerful company during the emperor's breakfast and morning correspondence. These sessions required a special kind of emotional intelligence, the ability to be engaging without being demanding, entertaining without being distracting, present without being intrusive. Alexios had mastered the art of morning companionship. He could discuss poetry while the emperor reviewed provincial reports, provide silent comfort during difficult decisions about military campaigns, or simply fade into the background when serious business demanded complete attention. This ability to modulate his presence according to imperial needs had kept him in favor longer than many of his predecessors, but he was acutely aware that his position remained precarious. The hierarchy among the concubines themselves created a complex web of relationships that combined genuine affection with vicious competition. At the top stood the current favorites, those who had captured the emperor's particular attention and enjoyed special privileges, better quarters, finer clothing, occasional gifts of jewelry, or even small amounts of money. These positions of favor were fiercely coveted and jealously guarded. Below the favorites came the regular rotation of concubines who provided companionship on a scheduled basis. They might be called upon for specific events: dinner parties where young male beauty served as living decoration, private moments when the emperor sought comfort from the pressures of rule, or cultural activities where their training in music and poetry proved valuable. At the bottom of the hierarchy languished those who had fallen from favor but not yet been dismissed from service. These unfortunate young men existed in a kind of limbo, maintaining the routines of concubinage while knowing that their chances of regaining imperial attention grew slimmer each day. Their presence served as a constant reminder to the others of how quickly fortunes could change in the imperial household. The psychological dynamics among the concubines revealed the full cruelty of the system. Natural human tendencies toward friendship and mutual support were constantly undermined by the knowledge that one person's success necessarily meant another's displacement. Secret alliances formed and dissolved based on the shifting currents of imperial favor. Information became currency, traded for temporary advantages or protection from rival schemes. Some concubines attempted to find security by specializing in particular skills or services. Marcus Fabius had survived 3 years by developing an encyclopedic knowledge of wine and becoming indispensable during the emperor's elaborate dinner parties. Another, known as Dionysios, had trained his voice to perfection and could sing the emperor to sleep during periods of insomnia. These specializations offered some protection, but they also created new vulnerabilities. What happened when the emperor's taste changed or a more skilled practitioner arrived? The relationship dynamics between individual concubines and the emperor were perhaps the most complex aspect of the entire system. Historical records suggest that genuine affection could develop within these arrangements, despite the fundamental power imbalance. Emperor Hadrian's relationship with Antinous appears to have involved real emotional attachment, at least on Hadrian's part. But even these seemingly positive connections carried their own dangers. Emperors who became too attached to individual concubines faced criticism from advisors who worried about political implications. A concubine who gained too much influence risked becoming a target for court factions seeking to limit imperial power or change policy directions. The young men themselves walked a tightrope between providing the emotional intimacy that kept them in favor and maintaining enough distance to avoid becoming political liabilities. The daily reality of imperial service combined moments of incredible luxury with constant underlying tension. A concubine might spend his morning in silk-draped chambers discussing philosophy with the most powerful man in the world, then spend his afternoon terrified that a careless word or gesture had triggered imperial displeasure. The emotional whiplash of this existence took a severe psychological toll that the historical record only hints at through scattered references to nervous ailments, mysterious illnesses, and sudden disappearances. Privacy was essentially non-existent for imperial concubines. Their movements were monitored, their conversations overheard, and their personal possessions subject to search at any time. Guards, other servants, and rival concubines all served as potential informants in a surveillance system that would have impressed modern totalitarian regimes. This constant observation created a paranoid atmosphere where genuine relationships became nearly impossible and personal expression was reduced to subtle gestures and coded communications. The physical spaces occupied by concubines reflected their ambiguous status within the imperial household. Their quarters were luxurious by any normal standard: marble floors, silk hangings, private bathrooms with heated water, and windows overlooking the palace gardens. Yet these same quarters could be locked from the outside, and their occupants could be confined at will. The beauty of their surroundings couldn't disguise the fundamental reality of their captivity. Evening hours brought different challenges and opportunities. When the emperor entertained guests, concubines might be displayed as living examples of imperial wealth and taste. They would recline on couches arranged around the dining area, providing visual pleasure while occasionally joining conversations about art, literature, or philosophy. These performances required perfect pitch. They needed to demonstrate their education and sophistication while never forgetting their subordinate status. Private evening hours with the emperor could range from intimate conversations to sexual encounters to simple companionship during periods of reflection or planning. The concubines learned to read imperial moods with extraordinary sensitivity, understanding when to speak and when to remain silent, when to offer comfort and when to provide distraction, when to be present and when to make themselves invisible. Sleep brought little respite from the pressures of imperial service. Even their dreams were not entirely their own. They might be awakened at any hour to attend to imperial needs or whims. The uncertainty of never knowing when they might be called upon created a state of chronic anxiety that manifested in various physical symptoms. Palace physicians treated numerous concubines for ailments that we would now recognize as stress-related disorders. The seasonal rhythms of imperial life created additional pressures and opportunities for the concubines. Summer travels to imperial villas might mean months away from Rome in the company of a smaller, more intimate household where individual attention was more likely. Winter months often brought increased social activities and public appearances where their beauty served imperial prestige. Military campaigns could mean either dangerous travels to frontier regions or lonely months waiting for the emperor's return. Religious festivals and public ceremonies presented particular challenges for the concubines. Roman society maintained complex attitudes toward male-male relationships that varied depending on context, social status, and specific activities involved. While imperial concubinage was an accepted reality, it existed in a kind of social gray area that required careful navigation during public appearances. The arrival of new concubines sent shockwaves through the existing hierarchy. Fresh faces meant new competition for imperial attention, but they also brought news from the outside world and reminders of the lives these young men had left behind. Veterans of the system took on informal mentoring roles, teaching newcomers the countless unwritten rules that governed survival in the imperial household. Physical health became a constant preoccupation as the concubines aged. Even minor blemishes could signal the beginning of the end for their imperial favor. They consulted physicians regularly, not for serious ailments but for the cosmetic concerns that could determine their fate. The pressure to maintain perfect appearance led some to dangerous practices, excessive exercise, extreme diets, and experimental treatments that sometimes caused more harm than the problems they were meant to solve. As we've seen, life behind palace walls for the emperor's male concubines was a complex mixture of luxury and terror, intimacy and isolation, privilege and powerlessness. These young men occupied a unique position in the Roman world. They were simultaneously among the most pampered individuals in the empire and among the most vulnerable. Their daily existence reveals the fundamental contradictions of a system that treated human beings as beautiful objects while still requiring them to maintain their humanity. But what we've explored so far represents only the experience of those who managed to maintain imperial favor. The darker reality of the concubine system becomes clear when we examine what happened to those who fell from grace, grew too old, or simply became inconvenient to imperial purposes. Their fates reveal the true cost of a system that valued beauty above humanity and treated young men's lives as disposable luxuries in the service of imperial power. The imperial messenger arrived at dawn with a scroll bearing the purple seal that meant immediate compliance was required. 23-year-old Gaius, once called Adonis by those who remembered his glory days, read the terse Latin phrases with hands that barely trembled. After 7 years in the imperial household, he had known this day would come. The message was bureaucratically brief. His services were no longer required, and he had until sunset to vacate his quarters. At 23, Gaius was ancient by the standards of imperial concubinage. The first gray hair had appeared 6 months ago, despite his desperate attempts to pluck it out before anyone noticed. His face had begun to show the first subtle signs of maturity that marked the end of the boyish beauty that had once made him indispensable to Emperor Trajan. Worse still, his body had started developing the broader shoulders and deeper chest that signaled the transition from youth to manhood, a transformation that spelled doom in a system that prized eternal adolescence. The process of imperial disposal was as systematized as everything else in the Roman administrative machine. Concubines who had served faithfully and posed no political threat might receive a small pension and transportation to a distant province where they could attempt to rebuild their lives. Those suspected of disloyalty or who knew inconvenient state secrets faced much darker fates. And those who had simply outlived their usefulness fell into a gray area where their survival depended on factors beyond their control: imperial mood, administrative efficiency, and sometimes pure chance. Gaius belonged to this middle category, which meant his future was uncertain but not necessarily hopeless. He had served 7 emperors over his years in the palace, had never been involved in political intrigue, and had maintained the discretion that was perhaps the most valuable skill any concubine could develop. His knowledge of state secrets was minimal. He had been valued more for his beauty and companionship than for his political acumen. This ignorance, cultivated deliberately by the palace administration, might now save his life. The psychological impact of dismissal was often more devastating than the material consequences. These young men had spent their formative years learning to define themselves entirely in relation to imperial favor. Their self-worth, their understanding of their place in the world, even their basic identity had been shaped by their role as objects of imperial desire. Suddenly stripped of this defining relationship, many former concubines experienced what we might now recognize as severe identity crises. Historical records suggest that depression, anxiety, and what the Romans called melancholia were common among dismissed concubines. Palace physicians documented cases of former favorites who refused to eat, couldn't sleep, or developed mysterious ailments that seemed to have no physical cause. Modern psychology would recognize these as symptoms of severe trauma and adjustment disorders, but Roman medicine had no framework for understanding the psychological devastation caused by their own system. The economic realities facing dismissed concubines were equally harsh. Despite years of luxury, most had accumulated little personal wealth. Their clothing, jewelry, and other apparent possessions belonged to the imperial household and remained behind when they left. The small monetary gifts they had received over the years were rarely sufficient to establish independent lives, especially for young men who had no practical job skills beyond those required for imperial companionship. Some former concubines attempted to leverage their education and cultural training into careers as private tutors or cultural advisors to wealthy Romans. A few succeeded, particularly those who had developed genuine expertise in music, poetry, or philosophy during their palace years. But these opportunities were limited and often came with their own dangers. Wealthy Romans who hired former imperial concubines were making political statements that could attract unwanted attention from current palace authorities. Others turned to the only profession where their specialized training and experience held value. They became procurers and trainers for the next generation of concubines. These men understood the system intimately and could command significant fees for their ability to identify, acquire, and prepare young men for imperial service. The moral implications of this career path were profound, survivors of the system becoming its perpetuators, but for many, it represented the only path to economic security. The geographical displacement that accompanied dismissal created additional trauma for former concubines. Most were sent to distant provinces, officially to ensure they couldn't cause problems in Rome but practically to sever any remaining connections to their former lives. A young man who had spent his teenage years in the marble halls of the Palatine Hill might find himself in a rough frontier town, struggling to adapt to a world he had never been prepared to navigate. Some dismissals were more dramatic and far more dangerous than Gaius's bureaucratic expulsion. When concubines became involved in political intrigue, either voluntarily or as unwilling pawns, their fates could be sealed with imperial stamps rather than imperial scrolls. The historical record contains scattered references to young men who disappeared during travels, or died of sudden illness, when their knowledge or associations became inconvenient. Emperor Domitian was particularly notorious for the violent elimination of former favorites who he suspected might pose security risks. His paranoia, which eventually led to his assassination, extended to anyone who had enjoyed intimate access to his person or knowledge of his private affairs. At least a dozen former concubines are believed to have been murdered on his orders, their deaths disguised as accidents or attributed to bandits during travel to distant provinces. The case of Marcus Flavius illustrates the extreme end of imperial displeasure. A favorite of Emperor Nero for nearly 3 years, Marcus had been present during several private conversations where the emperor discussed plans that later proved embarrassing or incriminating. When Nero's reign began to collapse, Marcus found himself viewed not as a discarded pleasure object but as a potential witness whose testimony could be dangerous to powerful people seeking to distance themselves from the fallen emperor. Marcus's body was found in the Tiber River 3 days after Nero's suicide, bearing wounds that suggested professional execution rather than random violence. No investigation was conducted, no questions were asked, and no record was kept beyond a brief administrative note about the disposal of his personal effects. His death served as a stark reminder to other former concubines about the long reach of imperial power and the permanent nature of state secrets. But not all stories ended in tragedy or exile. A remarkable few former concubines managed to transform their experiences into genuine success and even influence. The most famous example was Sporus, who began as one of Nero's concubines but managed to survive his patron's downfall and eventually gained the protection of subsequent emperors through a combination of political astuteness and valuable connections. Sporus's survival strategy involved carefully cultivating relationships with multiple power centers within the imperial administration. While serving as Nero's favorite, he had quietly developed friendships with freedmen who managed various aspects of government bureaucracy. When Nero fell, these connections provided protection and eventually opportunities. Sporus ended his life as a wealthy landowner in southern Italy, having successfully navigated one of history's most dangerous transitions. Another survivor, known in the records only as Alexandros the Syrian, parlayed his years of imperial service into a career as a cultural advisor and art dealer. His intimate knowledge of imperial tastes and his connections throughout the empire's artistic communities made him invaluable to wealthy Romans seeking to emulate imperial style. By the time of his death, Alexandros owned several villas and had established a trading network that extended from Spain to Egypt. These success stories, however, were extraordinary exceptions that proved the rule of general tragedy. For every former concubine who managed to build a new life, dozens disappeared into obscurity, poverty, or premature death. The system was designed to consume their youth and discard them when that youth faded, with little consideration for their survival beyond their period of usefulness. The psychological profiles of successful survivors reveal certain common characteristics that help them navigate the transition from imperial favor to independent life. Most had maintained some sense of personal identity separate from their role as concubines, often through secret hobbies, private correspondence, or clandestine relationships with other servants. They had also typically developed practical skills beyond those required for imperial companionship, learning languages, understanding commerce, or cultivating political awareness. More importantly, the survivors had learned to think strategically about their futures while still enjoying imperial favor. Rather than allowing themselves to become completely dependent on palace life, they had quietly prepared for the day when their services would no longer be required. This preparation often had to be conducted in secret, as concubines who appeared to be planning for life after imperial service might be suspected of disloyalty or lack of commitment. The timing of dismissal could dramatically affect a former concubine's prospects for survival. Those who left during periods of political stability faced better odds than those caught in the chaos of imperial transitions or military crises. Economic conditions throughout the empire also played a crucial role. A former concubine attempting to establish himself as a tutor or cultural advisor during prosperous times had far better chances than one seeking such opportunities during periods of recession or social upheaval. Regional differences in attitudes toward former concubines created geographical variations in survival prospects. The sophisticated urban centers of the Eastern Mediterranean were generally more tolerant of unconventional career paths and personal histories than the conservative rural communities of central Italy. A former concubine might find opportunities as a teacher or advisor in Athens or Alexandria that would be completely unavailable in small Italian towns where traditional Roman values dominated social attitudes. The support networks that developed among former concubines represented one of the few bright spots in otherwise grim stories. Despite the competitive atmosphere that had characterized their palace years, many former favorites maintained connections with others who had shared similar experiences. These informal networks provided emotional support, practical assistance, and sometimes business opportunities for men struggling to rebuild their lives. Letters discovered in Egyptian papyrus collections include correspondence between former concubines living in different parts of the empire, sharing news, offering advice, and providing mutual support. One particularly poignant letter from a former favorite named Julius to his friend Marcus includes the line, "We who have walked in marble halls must now make our peace with earthen floors, but we walk together still in spirit." The physical health consequences of years in imperial service created additional challenges for dismissed concubines. The stress of constant performance, the artificial lifestyle, and often the physical abuse that accompanied their service left many with chronic ailments that made independent survival even more difficult. Palace physicians had maintained their health only as long as they remained useful. Once dismissed, they had to navigate the empire's limited medical resources while dealing with conditions that were often poorly understood even by the best Roman doctors. Sexual identity and relationships presented particularly complex challenges for former concubines attempting to integrate into normal Roman society. Years of conditioning to serve as objects of male desire, combined with the trauma of their experiences, created psychological patterns that made traditional Roman marriage and family life extremely difficult. Some former concubines formed relationships with women and attempted to establish conventional families, but these marriages were often troubled by the men's inability to adapt to more equal partnership dynamics. Others found companionship with fellow survivors or with people on the margins of Roman society who were less judgmental about unconventional backgrounds. A few established long-term relationships that provided emotional stability and mutual support, creating alternative family structures that helped them heal from their traumatic experiences. The aging process itself became a source of profound anxiety for former concubines in ways that were unique to their experiences. Having spent their formative years obsessing over every physical change that might signal the end of their imperial usefulness, many continued this hypervigilance throughout their lives. Normal signs of aging that other Romans accepted as natural triggered severe anxiety responses in men who had been trained to view physical change as existential threat. Religious and philosophical consolation played important roles in helping some former concubines cope with their new realities. The mystery religions that were gaining popularity throughout the empire offered communities of believers who emphasized spiritual rather than physical beauty, personal transformation, and the possibility of redemption from past suffering. Several former concubines are known to have become devoted followers of Mithras, Isis, or other deities whose cults provided alternative value systems and supportive communities. As we examine these individual stories of survival, failure, and transformation, we begin to understand the full human cost of the Roman imperial concubine system. These weren't just casualties of personal vice or cultural excess. They were victims of an institutionalized system that treated human beings as disposable luxuries in the service of imperial power and prestige. But their stories also reveal remarkable resilience and humanity in the face of systematic dehumanization. The very fact that some managed to survive and rebuild their lives speaks to the indomitable nature of human dignity and the power of individual agency even within the most oppressive systems. Their experiences offer profound lessons about survival, identity, and the possibility of healing from even the most severe trauma. However, individual stories of success and failure only tell part of the larger tale. As the Roman Empire itself began to change, politically, culturally, and religiously, the entire system of imperial concubinage faced pressures that would eventually lead to its transformation and ultimate extinction. The rise of Christianity, the division of the empire, and changing attitudes towards sexuality and power created a perfect storm that would sweep away an institution that had existed for over 4 centuries. Understanding how this system finally collapsed requires us to examine not just individual fates but the broader historical forces that made imperial concubinage incompatible with the new Rome that was emerging in the 3rd and 4th centuries AD. The stories of the last generation of imperial concubines reveal both the persistence of old patterns and the irresistible force of historical change. The great marble statue of Antinous stood in the Villa Hadriana like a ghost from a vanishing world. By 325 AD, nearly 2 centuries after Hadrian's beloved concubine had drowned in the Nile, the sprawling imperial estate had become a monument to a way of life that was rapidly disappearing. Emperor Constantine walked past the statue without acknowledgement, his Christian advisors having made clear their disapproval of what they called the pagan excesses of earlier reigns. The transformation of the Roman Empire under Constantine marked the beginning of the end for the institution of imperial male concubinage. For over 4 centuries, emperors had maintained households that included dozens of beautiful young men whose primary function was to provide intimate companionship and sexual pleasure. But the rise of Christianity, combined with changing political structures and evolving social attitudes, created pressures that made this ancient practice increasingly untenable. Constantine himself had been raised in an empire where male concubines were as much a part of imperial life as purple robes and golden crowns. His predecessors had thought no more of maintaining harems of young men than they did of keeping stables of fine horses. But Constantine's conversion to Christianity in 312 AD introduced a moral framework that viewed such practices not as imperial prerogatives but as sinful abominations that endangered both earthly rule and eternal salvation. The Christian critique of imperial concubinage was multifaceted and devastating. Church fathers like John Chrysostom argued that the practice violated natural law, corrupted imperial judgment, and set a horrible example for Christian subjects throughout the empire. More practically, Christian bishops understood that emperors who surrounded themselves with male lovers could never serve as effective leaders of a faith that emphasized heterosexual marriage and family values as the foundation of Christian society. But the religious transformation was only part of a larger shift in imperial culture and politics. The old Roman Empire of Augustus and Hadrian had been a Mediterranean civilization that drew its cultural values from Greek philosophy, Egyptian mysticism, and Persian luxury. The new Christian empire that emerged under Constantine looked north to the Germanic tribes for military strength and found its moral compass in the austere teachings of Syrian monks and North African bishops. This cultural reorientation had profound implications for imperial lifestyle and presentation. The elaborate court ceremonies that had showcased imperial concubines as living symbols of wealth and power now seemed embarrassingly pagan to Christian advisors who preferred simplicity and moral authority to sensual display. The intimate dinner parties where beautiful young men had reclined alongside emperors discussing poetry and philosophy were replaced by formal audiences where bishops and administrators conducted the business of governing a Christian empire. The practical politics of imperial transformation also worked against the concubine system. Constantine's empire was almost constantly at war, either defending frontiers against barbarian invasions or fighting civil wars against rival claimants to imperial power. The mobile military headquarters that served as the real seat of government had no place for the luxury and leisure that imperial concubinage required. An emperor who spent his days planning military campaigns and his nights reviewing intelligence reports had little time for the elaborate rituals of intimate companionship that had entertained his predecessors. Economic factors accelerated the decline of imperial concubinage. The Roman economy of the 4th century was under severe strain from military expenses, barbarian raids, and the costs of maintaining multiple capital cities across the empire. The enormous expense of maintaining large households of concubines, with their specialized training, luxury accommodations, and constant replacement needs, became increasingly difficult to justify when imperial resources were desperately needed for defense and administration. The geographic division of the empire between eastern and western capitals also disrupted the traditional systems that had supplied and maintained imperial concubines. The elaborate networks that had transported beautiful young men from every corner of the empire to Rome became harder to maintain when political authority was divided between Constantinople, Milan, Trier, and other administrative centers. Local commanders and provincial governors, struggling with their own resource constraints, became less willing to divert talented young men to imperial households when they needed every available person for military or agricultural service. But perhaps the most significant factor in the decline of imperial concubinage was the changing nature of imperial power itself. The old principate system, where emperors ruled as first citizens among equals, had evolved into the dominate, where emperors were distant, godlike figures who ruled through elaborate bureaucracies rather than personal relationships. The intimate atmosphere that had made imperial concubinage both possible and desirable was incompatible with the new model of sacred, unapproachable imperial authority. The last emperor known to have maintained a traditional household of male concubines was Julian, who ruled from 361 to 363 AD and attempted to restore pagan practices throughout the empire. Julian's court included several young men who served in the traditional concubine roles, and his personal correspondence includes references to intimate relationships that followed the patterns established by earlier emperors. But Julian's reign was brief, and his death in Persia marked the end of serious attempts to restore pre-Christian imperial practices. However, the formal abandonment of imperial concubinage didn't mean the immediate disappearance of the young men who had served in these roles. The imperial household of 325 AD still included dozens of former concubines whose dismissal created both practical problems and potential security risks. Many of these men possessed detailed knowledge of imperial private life, political secrets, and administrative procedures that could be dangerous if they fell into the wrong hands. Constantine's solution was characteristically systematic and ruthlessly practical. Former concubines were offered three options: voluntary exile to distant monasteries where they could spend their remaining lives in Christian contemplation, transportation to frontier regions where they could establish new lives as colonists, or enrollment in special military units where their education and court experience made them valuable as administrators and intelligence officers. The monastic option appealed to many former concubines who had been traumatized by their experiences and sought refuge from a world that had treated them as disposable luxuries. The early Christian monastic movement, with its emphasis on celibacy, spiritual transformation, and communal support, offered psychological healing and social acceptance that was unavailable in secular society. Several monasteries in Syria and Egypt developed reputations as refuges for former palace servants seeking to rebuild their lives through religious devotion. Military service provided a different kind of redemption for former concubines who retained enough physical and mental vigor for active careers. The Roman army of the 4th century desperately needed educated administrators who could handle the complex logistics of frontier warfare and civil administration. Young men who had been trained in languages, mathematics, and cultural sensitivity found their skills highly valued in military contexts, even if their sexual history made them unsuitable for traditional civilian careers. The frontier colonization program represented the most ambitious attempt to transform former concubines into productive imperial citizens. Large estates in recently conquered territories were distributed to groups of former palace servants who were expected to establish agricultural communities and serve as cultural ambassadors for Roman civilization. These settlements had mixed success. Some thrived and became prosperous farming communities, while others failed due to inexperience, local hostility, or the psychological difficulties that many colonists faced in adapting to completely different lives. But not all former concubines accepted these official options for their post-imperial lives. A significant number simply disappeared into the underground economy of late Roman society, using their education, connections, and knowledge of luxury goods to establish careers as merchants, cultural advisors, or private tutors. The informal networks that had developed among former concubines proved valuable in these transitions, providing business partnerships, financial support, and emotional solidarity for men navigating dangerous social transformations. Some former concubines found opportunities in the entertainment industry that was emerging to serve the growing Christian population. Their training in music, poetry, and performance could be adapted to create religious pageants, educational programs, and cultural events that met Christian standards while providing sophisticated entertainment for wealthy converts. A few became prominent composers of Christian hymns or writers of religious poetry, their artistic talents finally finding expression in socially acceptable forms. The eastern and western portions of the empire developed different approaches to dealing with the legacy of imperial concubinage. The Eastern Empire, centered in Constantinople, maintained more of the old Roman administrative traditions and cultural practices. While Emperor Theodosius I officially prohibited imperial concubinage in 390 AD, the Byzantine court that emerged in the following centuries retained some of the ceremonial and cultural elements that had characterized the old system, adapted to meet Christian requirements. The Western Empire, facing more severe military and economic pressures, took a more pragmatic approach to former concubines and the cultural practices they represented. Western emperors were more likely to integrate former concubines into military and administrative roles where their skills could serve immediate practical needs, regardless of moral concerns about their previous experiences. The Visigothic and Ostrogothic kingdoms that emerged from the collapse of the Western Empire inherited many former Roman institutions, including some former concubines who had survived the political transitions. These Germanic kingdoms had different cultural attitudes towards sexuality and personal relationships, and some former Roman concubines found opportunities for social integration that had been impossible under Christian Roman rule. Archaeological evidence from late imperial sites reveals the material traces of this institutional transformation. Excavations at the Palace of Diocletian in Split, Croatia, show modifications made during the Christian period that eliminated the private quarters and entertainment spaces where concubines had once lived and worked. Similar adaptations can be found at imperial sites throughout the former empire, as palace architecture was modified to reflect changing social values and administrative needs. The legal framework that had governed imperial concubinage was systematically dismantled during the 4th and 5th centuries. Laws that had regulated the purchase, training, and maintenance of concubines were repealed and replaced with Christian marriage laws that emphasized monogamy, spiritual partnership, and family stability. The legal status of former concubines was clarified through a series of edicts that granted them citizenship rights while prohibiting them from seeking imperial employment or pursuing certain types of careers. Literary sources from the late imperial period provide glimpses of public attitudes toward the changing practices. Christian writers like Augustine and Jerome wrote extensively about the moral transformation of imperial government, praising the abandonment of pagan luxuries, while calling for Christian charity toward those who had been victimized by the old system. Pagan authors like Ammianus Marcellinus wrote more nostalgically about the cultural losses that accompanied political transformation, lamenting the disappearance of the refined court life that had produced so much art, poetry, and philosophical discussion. The international implications of abandoning imperial concubinage were significant for Roman diplomatic relations with other empires and kingdoms. The Persian Sassanid Empire, which had maintained similar practices for centuries, initially viewed the Roman transformation as a sign of weakness or cultural confusion. Diplomatic exchanges from this period include Persian complaints that Roman envoys no longer understood the cultural protocols that had governed international relations for generations. Similarly, relations with various Germanic tribes and later kingdoms were complicated by cultural misunderstandings related to changing Roman practices. Germanic leaders who had expected to be entertained in traditional Roman fashion were confused by the new Christian austerity of imperial courts, while Roman diplomats struggled to navigate foreign courts that maintained practices that their own empire had abandoned. The economic disruption caused by dismantling the concubine system extended far beyond the immediate costs of providing for displaced young men. Entire industries that had supported imperial concubinage, specialized education, luxury goods production, transportation networks, and cultural services, were forced to adapt to new markets or face extinction. Many craftsmen and service providers who had depended on imperial contracts found themselves competing in much more limited markets for private clients who lacked imperial resources. Regional variations in the pace and thoroughness of transformation created patchwork patterns across the empire. Areas with strong Christian populations embraced the changes enthusiastically, while regions with persistent pagan traditions attempted to maintain modified versions of traditional practices. Some provincial governors continued to maintain small numbers of male companions well into the 5th century, officially classifying them as cultural advisors or administrative assistants to avoid direct conflict with imperial policy. The underground continuation of practices similar to imperial concubinage represented one of the most significant challenges to Christian transformation of Roman society. Wealthy private citizens, particularly those with pagan sympathies or nostalgia for traditional Roman culture, sometimes attempted to recreate the imperial household model on a smaller scale in their private estates. These private arrangements were technically legal as long as they avoided explicit sexual relationships, but they created ongoing tensions between Christian authorities and traditionalist elites. As the Western Roman Empire collapsed entirely during the 5th century, the last remnants of imperial concubinage disappeared with the political structures that had sustained them. The final Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed in 476 AD by Germanic chieftain Odoacer, who had no interest in maintaining the cultural practices of his Roman predecessors. The boy emperor himself was essentially a prisoner of his Germanic guardians, hardly in a position to maintain the household luxuries that his predecessors had taken for granted. The Eastern Empire survived these political catastrophes and evolved into the Byzantine Empire, which maintained modified versions of some Roman traditions for another 1,000 years. However, Byzantine imperial households were organized according to Christian principles and never included the male concubines that had been central to earlier Roman court life. The elaborate court ceremonies of Byzantium incorporated some of the aesthetic and cultural elements that had once been associated with imperial concubinage, but within a framework of Christian morality that emphasized spiritual rather than physical beauty. Looking back on this period of transformation, we can see how the decline of imperial concubinage reflected much larger changes in Roman civilization itself. The intimate, personal style of imperial rule that had characterized the Principate gave way to the distant, bureaucratic authority of the dominate and eventually to the theocratic governance of Christian emperors. The Mediterranean cultural synthesis that had embraced diverse traditions and practices was replaced by a more uniform Christian culture that emphasized moral conformity over aesthetic diversity. The young men who had served as imperial concubines during this transitional period found themselves caught between two worlds: the dying pagan culture that had created their roles and the emerging Christian society that had no place for their experiences or skills. Their individual stories of adaptation, survival, and often tragedy provide a human perspective on one of history's most significant cultural transformations. But their experiences also illuminate the costs of rapid social change and the human price of moral reformation. The Christian transformation of the Roman Empire brought many genuine benefits: greater emphasis on human dignity, protection for the vulnerable, and more stable family structures. However, it also created new forms of exclusion and persecution for those whose lives didn't fit into the new moral framework. As we approach the final chapter of our exploration, we'll examine how the memory of imperial concubinage was preserved, suppressed, and eventually rediscovered by later generations. The archaeological and literary evidence that allows us to reconstruct their stories today represents the surviving fragments of lives that were systematically erased from official history for over a millennium. Their voices, silenced by the triumph of Christian morality and the collapse of Roman political structures, can still speak to us across the centuries if we're willing to listen. What they tell us about power, sexuality, survival, and human dignity remains relevant to our understanding of both ancient and modern societies. The voices of Rome's male concubines whisper to us through fragments. A broken inscription here, a skeletal remain there, testimony preserved in the margins of more important histories. Unlike their female counterparts, who appear in literature and legal documents with some frequency, these young men left behind traces so faint they might almost be ghosts. Recent excavations at Villa Adriana have unearthed quarters that archaeologists now believe housed Emperor Hadrian's personal attendants. The rooms are smaller than those designated for slaves, yet more luxurious than typical servant quarters, a liminal space that perfectly captures the ambiguous status these young men occupied. Carbon dating of organic materials found within suggests periods of both comfort and confinement, with evidence of fine textiles alongside what appeared to be restraints. The most compelling archaeological evidence comes from a cemetery discovered outside Pompeii in 2019. Among the volcanic ash-preserved remains, researchers found the skeleton of a young man, approximately 16 to 18 years old, buried with unusual grave goods. A golden amulet depicting Ganymede, expensive perfume bottles, and a collar marked with an owner's name. Most telling was a healed fracture in his jaw, evidence of violence that had mended before his death in the eruption. Papyrus fragments from Oxyrhynchus provide tantalizing glimpses into their daily lives. One document, likely from the 2nd century CE, contains what appears to be a training manual for young male concubines, detailing everything from proper posture during banquets to techniques for applying cosmetics. Another fragment preserves a letter from a concerned father, pleading for news of his son who had been selected for imperial service, a euphemism that carried both honor and dread. The Codex Theodosianus, compiled in 438 CE, contains laws that indirectly reference these arrangements. While never explicitly naming male concubinage, the legal language around inappropriate relationships with imperial household members and regulations concerning young men of good family in service to the court paint a clear picture of institutional structures designed to both facilitate and conceal these relationships. Perhaps most poignant are the medical texts. Cyrenus of Ephesus, writing in the 2nd century, includes treatments for what he delicately terms injuries common to those serving in intimate household positions. The clinical language cannot mask the human suffering it describes: remedies for internal trauma, treatments for depression, and methods for concealing physical evidence of abuse. Modern discoveries that reveal their stories. DNA analysis of remains found in Roman villa contexts has begun to tell stories that written records deliberately obscured. A 2021 study of burials at a villa outside Rome revealed that several young men, initially assumed to be slaves, actually came from aristocratic families, their bones showing signs of good nutrition in childhood followed by periods of stress and malnutrition. Ground-penetrating radar at Nero's Domus Aurea has revealed previously unknown chambers that architectural historians believe were designed for private entertainments. The layout suggests sophisticated systems for both concealment and surveillance, rooms that could be quickly sealed off from public areas, with hidden passages allowing discreet movement. Digital reconstruction of frescoes from Capri has revealed details invisible to earlier scholars. Using infrared spectroscopy, researchers have uncovered painted-over scenes that appear to depict young men in compromising positions with older figures wearing imperial regalia. The deliberate concealment of these images suggests later attempts to sanitize the historical record. Modern psychological analysis of surviving letters and memoirs has identified patterns consistent with trauma responses. The writings of Suetonius, Tacitus, and Dio Cassius, when examined through contemporary understanding of abuse dynamics, reveal descriptions of behaviors now recognized as symptoms of complex PTSD, dissociation, hypervigilance, and self-destructive patterns among young men in imperial courts. Comparative studies with other historical periods have illuminated practices that Roman sources deliberately obscured. Parallels with Byzantine court eunuchs, Ottoman palace pages, and Chinese imperial attendants reveal common patterns of recruitment, training, and disposal that suggest these weren't aberrations of individual emperors but systematic institutional practices. Parallels with other historical periods and cultures. The phenomenon of powerful men surrounding themselves with vulnerable young males appears across cultures and centuries with disturbing consistency. In medieval Islamic courts, ghulams, slave soldiers, often began their service as children, subject to both military training and sexual exploitation. Like their Roman predecessors, they occupied a space between slave and free, gaining access to power while remaining utterly dependent on their master's whims. The Ottoman devshirme system institutionalized similar practices, recruiting Christian boys for conversion and service in the Sultan's household. These young men could rise to positions of tremendous power, some becoming grand viziers, yet remained legally and psychologically property of the Sultan. Contemporary accounts describe the same mixture of opportunity and exploitation that characterized Roman arrangements. In Tokugawa, Japan, the tradition of wakashu, adolescent male prostitutes, served both merchant and samurai classes. Like Roman concubines, these young men existed in a liminal space, too old to be children, too young to be men, their transitional status making them simultaneously desirable and expendable. Even closer to our own time, the British public school system and various religious institutions have perpetuated similar dynamics. Powerful older men selecting and grooming vulnerable young males, using institutional authority to normalize what would otherwise be recognized as abuse. The common thread across all these cultures is the way institutional power creates systems that simultaneously celebrate and destroy young masculinity. Whether draped in religious ceremony, military tradition, or imperial splendor, the underlying dynamic remains consistent. The powerful consuming the vulnerable under the guise of mentorship, education, or honor. What their fate tells us about power, sexuality, and humanity. The story of Roman male concubines illuminates uncomfortable truths about how power operates across time and culture. These young men were not aberrations or exceptions. They were the inevitable result of systems that concentrate power without accountability, that create hierarchies based on domination rather than service. Their fate reveals how institutions can transform exploitation into tradition, making the abnormal seem natural through repetition and ritual. The Roman Empire didn't invent the sexual exploitation of vulnerable young men, but it perfected the art of making such exploitation appear noble, even sacred. The deliberate erasure of their voices from official histories demonstrates how power writes itself into permanence while writing its victims into oblivion. We know the names of emperors and generals, architects and poets, but the names of most concubines died with them. This selective preservation of memory is itself a form of violence, the final insult added to lifetimes of injury. Yet their story also reveals something profound about human resilience. In fragments and shadows, traces of their humanity persist. A letter home. A poem scratched on a wall. A grave good chosen for comfort rather than display. These tiny acts of self-assertion, preserved against all odds, testify to spirits that refuse to be entirely broken. Their fate warns us that civilization's greatest achievements can coexist with systematic cruelty, that beauty and brutality often spring from the same source. The same culture that gave us the Pantheon and Virgil's poetry also normalized the destruction of countless young lives. Progress is not linear, and sophistication is not synonymous with humanity. Final call to action and series conclusion. As we close this examination of Rome's male concubines, we must confront what their story demands of us. These young men cannot speak for themselves across the centuries, but their silence itself speaks volumes about who gets remembered and who gets forgotten, whose suffering matters and whose can be safely ignored. Their story is not safely quarantined in the ancient past. The same dynamics that destroyed them operate in our world today, in institutions that prioritize reputation over protection, in systems that create opportunities for predators, in cultures that mistake silence for consent and compliance for choice. We honor their memory not through pity but through vigilance. Every time we speak up against institutional abuse, challenge power that operates without accountability, or insist that the vulnerable deserve protection regardless of their status, we strike a blow against the systems that destroyed them. Their story reminds us that history belongs not just to the powerful who recorded it, but to all who lived it, including those whose voices were silenced. In recovering their stories, we commit to ensuring that such silencing becomes impossible in our own time. The echoes of their suffering should not fade into mere academic curiosity. They should ring as warnings, calling us to build institutions worthy of human dignity, to create systems that serve rather than consume the vulnerable, to remember that true civilization is measured not by its monuments but by how it treats those who cannot defend themselves. In speaking their names, even when those names are lost, we ensure that their deaths were not meaningless. In refusing to let their stories disappear, we join the long chain of those who insist that every human life has value, that every story deserves telling, that every voice matters. The Roman Empire fell, but the choices that defined it echo still. The question is not whether such systems will emerge again, they already have, in forms both familiar and strange. The question is whether we will recognize them in time, speak against them with courage, and build something better from their ruins. These young men deserve more than our sympathy. They deserve our commitment to ensuring that their story never repeats itself. In their memory, let us choose justice over power, protection over prestige, and the difficult truth over comfortable silence. Their echo in time calls us to answer. What will we do with the power we have? How will we use our voices? And when history judges our choices, what story will our actions tell? The voices of Rome's male concubines have waited 2 millennia to be heard. Now that we have listened, the responsibility passes to us. May we prove worthy of their trust.